So you've done a lot of work with LI Squared and talking about your learn phase, and we've heard from Claire about the science and the benefits of TANF and child work collaboration, and how just making some changes can help a family become more stable. So, but what we want to talk about today is leading through change, roles, responsibilities, and expectations. And we think that's important because you're only a small subset of your team that you have back at home. So once you leave here, after you've taken all your knowledge and brainstormed, how can you initiate and lead the change throughout the process? So that's what our speaker is going to talk to you about. She is Amy Templeman. She's a kinship and adoptive parent, and she is a senior director of child and family well-being at Social Current. And in case you don't recognize what Social Current is, they're the people who had that nice spread that we walk by all day long. So in her role, she works to support families and promote equity. Before joining Social Current, Amy served as the executive director of the Federal Commission to Eliminate Child Abuse and Neglect Fatalities. Amy also helped to establish the Office of Wellbeing at the District of Columbia Child Welfare Agency, where she conducted strategic planning and oversaw programs to address substance abuse, domestic violence, education, housing, and child care. She's busy, works at Urban Institute and the Johns Hopkins University, managing community-based participatory research grant focused on adolescent mental health. So I would like to introduce Amy Templeman.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that introduction, and thank you all for having me here. I'm feeling a little guilty about the Social Current spread across the hallway. I didn't arrive early enough to see it, but I hear that it looks pretty good. There are still some members of our board of directors walking around and our executive leadership team. So if you like this session on your way out, give them a thumbs up. If you don't like this session, I'll give you my card and we can talk separately afterwards. I think I'm supposed to have a clicker up here somewhere. Let me just check and see if it's working. Okay, it is. Great. So I was asked to talk to you about change management. And as I was preparing for this session, I realized I think everyone I know in the social sector, especially in child welfare and TANF, is probably already an expert on change management, right? I mean, I think we've all led through multiple directors, administrators, governors, leaders of many types, political agendas. There's always so much changing in our sector. It's hard to keep up with. So I'm not sure that I will tell you anything today that you haven't already experienced or can identify with, but I'm hoping that what I prompt you to do is take some time to reflect on how your change management experience thus far in your career has prepared you for exactly what you're here to do today. And I have to tell you, when I read the announcement about this learning collaborative, I guess about a month ago or something like that, I was so impressed and so excited to see which jurisdictions, which tribes were going to be chosen. And it's just really great to be with you all and to know how much you are setting out to do in the next year. So I will be watching you all closely, and I'm just really glad to spend time with you. So when I was thinking back in my career, I've been in child welfare and public health for 23 years. And about 7 of those years were with a public child welfare agency. I work in the nonprofit sector now for Social Current. There were 3 main things that I've learned that I wanted to share with you. So those 3 things around change management for me have been that culture really matters, that relationships are absolutely everything. That one seems to be more clear to me every year. And then we are all communicators. So I'm going to tell you a story or give you an example about all 3 of these things. And I'm going to start with culture matters. So when I was working for the District of Columbia Child Welfare Agency, I was there for about 6 years. The first thing I need to tell you is that we had 4 directors in 6 years, which meant we had 4 strategic plans in 6 years, 4 sets of priorities in 6 years, and our city council was always changing as well. So lots of change going on all the time there. But I was thinking back to cross-systems collaboration, knowing what you all are setting out to do here together. And I think the time that culture really showed up as important for me in my career was when the Child Welfare Agency started collaborating differently with behavioral health. And this initially started because we were looking at our data around parents and youth who needed to be screened for substance use disorders, who were connected to child welfare. And our data was really bad. We had a hard time getting parents assessed, getting them into treatments. There were long waiting lists, and the same data was true for youth. And our city council was pretty upset about this at the time. And they said, you know, you've got to figure this out. We don't know whose fault it is. We don't know what's going wrong in the city, but you need to figure this out. So we started meeting with the Department of Behavioral Health. And we went into those meetings with a lot of assumptions about them and assumptions about what they knew about us. What we learned pretty quickly was they were not familiar with reunification timeframes. They were not familiar with family court requirements. They weren't familiar with court-ordered services. So we had a lot of educating that we needed to do as child welfare staff for the behavioral staff, for them to even understand the language that we were using and the culture that we were coming from, what our values were. And so I started thinking a little bit more about what culture looks like for systems. And I found this wheel. I hadn't seen this before, but it's called the culture wheel, and it kind of breaks down the different components of what goes into a culture. And as I was thinking about the Child and Family Services agency I worked for, you know, we had different tools that we used in our work, of course. We had different values. We had a different community, different constituents who we were serving compared to behavioral health, different language, different traditions and techniques. And then the behavioral health system had the same kinds of differences as us. But I really like this quote that I found from Joy Harjo, who was the first Native American US poet laureate for a few years, 2019 to 2021. And Joy says that a story matrix can connect all of us. There are rules, processes, and circles of responsibility in this world. And the story begins exactly where it is supposed to begin. We cannot skip any part. And this was a reminder to me that we really had to think at the time about, okay, what's important for behavioral health to know about us? What's going to matter to them? And then what do we really need to learn about them so that we can change the way we're working together? And I think what we ended up doing in some ways is building a third culture of shared understanding, because after about 2 years of collaboration, in-depth technical assistance from SAMHSA, which was wonderful, we were able to take the data and we were able to take our processes, and then looking at the data, we made some big changes. So for the adults who had been assessed by the Department of Behavioral Health, we were able to increase that number by 35%. People who had just been sitting and waiting to get assessed were finally getting assessed. But the bigger change was around the actual wait time to get into treatment, because they were able to prioritize child welfare families. The waiting time when we started the project was 14 days, and we were able to decrease it to 36 hours. Now, this was 10 years ago. I know waiting times have increased everywhere since then for substance use disorder treatment, but that was a really big deal to us at the time. And I was convinced that if we hadn't taken the time to do that cross-cultural exchange with each other and kind of break down some of those assumptions, we wouldn't have gotten that far. So the next thing is about relationships. Relationships really are everything. And the example I want to give you is from a project that I just finished on September 30th called Child Safety Forward. This was a 4-year demonstration initiative funded by the Department of Justice and the Office for Victims of Crime. My organization, Social Current, was chosen as the technical assistance provider. We hired about 8 consultants from other national organizations to work with us. And then there were 5 demonstration sites. One of them was Michigan. I think we have Michigan in the room, right? All right. We had the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. I think it's the Children's Services Administration within the department who we worked with. Trinity Health of New England in Connecticut, Cook County Health in Chicago, the Child Abuse Prevention Council of Sacramento. We have a California table somewhere here. And then Indiana Department of Health. The relationships went in so many different directions. When we started, I really thought, okay, it's going to be important for the technical assistance team to develop relationships with the demonstration sites. They will need to trust us. They'll need to know when to come to us with a question. They can't be afraid to ask a dumb question. And that was true. But over time, really in the first 6 months, we learned that those relationships between the demonstration sites were even more important, because sometimes if they took a question to one of their peers, they could get a much better answer, more relevant to what they needed in that moment than if they came to the technical assistance team. So we kind of became relationship brokers, encouraging them to reach out to each other. And now that they've spent 4 years together, in their sustainability plans, they're all talking about how they will remain connected. Some of them have applied for grants together. So there's a lot of value, I think, in really fostering those relationships. It also meant that we were able to learn very quickly because we spent so much time on relationships and building trust. So within the first year of Child Safety Forward, we learned a lot about the topic of the project, which was how do we reduce child fatalities and serious injuries from maltreatment. This cohort was tasked with creating a new model for doing that. And if you're familiar with child fatality data from maltreatment, year after year, it pretty much looks the same. We saw some improvements during COVID, thanks in large part to some of the economic and concrete supports that came our way. But generally, the data looks basically the same. So the Department of Justice and their Office for Victims of Crime wanted us to create a new model. So one of the first things that the demonstration sites looked at was who's in our community, who's going to help us figure this out, locally. And they started inviting parents into their meetings, parents and other community members. And some of the parents would show up and realize some of this child fatality data they had never seen before. They saw the stories in the media, but they never knew, on a larger scale what that local data looked like, how it compared to other places. And they were angry. They were really angry. How could you be looking at this data without us? How could the state agencies and the community organizations be coming up with solutions without us? We need to be here. We need to be at the center. So that's why our very first learning was one of the 3 core conditions for doing this work differently was elevating families into relationships of equal power within systems. One of our sites, the one in Connecticut, has a parent who tells us that parents need to represent 51% of the people at the table in every meeting where decisions are being made about families. And I'll never forget that, because how often do we really have a table that looks like that? And if it does, how much real power do they have in those situations? They also told us about being intentional around assessing and addressing racism and sustaining a communication strategy that's proactive rather than reactive. In child welfare, we're so used to kind of sitting back and answering questions after something occurs, especially with the media, rather than announcing some of our prevention solution resources, things that we want the community to know about. I am 100% sure we wouldn't have learned these things this quickly if we hadn't spent so much time not only on our relationships with them, but helping them develop good, trusting relationships within their communities as well. Our evaluator tells us that one of the key findings that she found through all of the data in this 4-year experience was that in creating this shared responsibility about child safety, we need to be intentional about strengthening our systems from the inside. So it kind of goes back to some of what the feedback that we got from the parents. We've been trying to fix problems from the outside in, but what if we're fixing them from the inside out? That's really where we can develop deeper relationships and make a more meaningful impact with our community at times. And we also learned that this group was challenging the status quo in multiple ways. They were challenging our definition of sustainability. Rather than thinking about sustainability as, do you have funding to continue this? We started looking at, how strong are your relationships? Are your relationships strong enough that you can continue working together the way that you have been, that was successful? What does the trust look like? Is the trust there? Have you shifted power? How are you engaging the community? And have you built a collaborative that can withstand different gaps in funding? They were also using data differently, especially around data ownership, and who had access to different kinds of data, being as transparent as they could be. And parent and community voice, I already mentioned, really focusing on the collaboration and the people rather than just, this is the work that needs to get done and needs to be funded. The other thing that we learned is really possible is moving from a focus on risk factors to a focus on protective factors. And I think I saw in the interest webinar or in one of the materials I read before today that some of you are looking at protective capacities in your jurisdictions as well. So this is a big shift in the child fatality space. If you've ever sat on a child death review team or child fatality review team, they're really focused on risk factors. And I understand why. That's most of the information we have available to us after a tragedy is, what were the risk factors? But flipping that upside down and looking at protective factors can be a lot more useful in terms of understanding what the prevention resources can be for other families. What are the opportunities to lift families up, to support them early on before there's any kind of risk of harm? So all 5 of the demonstration sites started heading in that direction. And that was also a little bit scary for them because they had never done it before. And I know that our relationships that we had built with them kind of allowed them to be a little bit more courageous and operate in an unfamiliar space. We also started sharing our learning very early on in the 4-year experience. We started publishing op-eds and blogs within the first 3 or 4 months. In the end of the 4 years, we had published 100 articles, either in national, state, or local media. And some of those articles were about our failures. Some of them were about things that we were getting wrong and mistakes that we were making. Some of them were about successes too, but we felt like we owed it to the field to save everybody time if we tell you what we did wrong so that you can avoid repeating it, rather than waiting 4 years until we know what our successes have been. And then finally, this willingness to understand power and this willingness to deeply and genuinely engage through relationships, it led to trust. I think it led to innovation. I think it led to people being bolder than they might have been otherwise. We also, because it was 4 years, we went through the pandemic together. So the 5 demonstrations and the technical assistance team all at the same time moved from an office to being at home. We were all trying to figure out how to juggle family for many of us with setting up a home office. Some of the people at the demonstration sites got directed to be on COVID task forces. So they even had to leave and come in and out. And thank goodness we had a funder at DOJ who understood all of that. And she gave us so much grace and flexibility around that time. The third thing I want to talk about is communications. And whenever I talk about communications, I always give a disclaimer that I'm not a communications professional, but I really want to stop saying that because I really think if you're in the social sector, if you're doing work with public, with children, with families, you are a communications professional. We have so many opportunities to talk about our work in every setting. I'm not just talking about with the media. When you go home at night, when you're talking with your family, with your friends, with your neighbors, and they ask what you do, all of those are opportunities to shape the way people see our work and shape the way people see the children and families who benefit from our work. So I would encourage you to think of yourself as a communicator, and I'm going to leave you with a couple of tools today around communications that I'm hoping will benefit you all, maybe in this collaborative or maybe in others as well. So I work with a group called Rally. They're a communications firm, and they have been collecting data on the media landscape of how the media talks about children and families. And they've been doing this for a long time. But this is a map of what the media was talking about in 2021, especially around child welfare. And the main theme here is that there wasn't really a clear narrative about the need to strengthen and support families. That's not language. Supporting families wasn't really coming up in the media that much. Instead, they were finding articles around the topics listed on the right side, foster care and some pandemic relief, needing more foster families, foster care awareness month, but really driven by foster care as the main solution. And knowing that you all are working on prevention, I thought it might be interesting for you to see how this has shifted in just a very short time. So this is 2021. This is 2022. In 2022, we started to see a new narrative form around the need to strengthen and support families. And a lot of that is because of the COVID relief packages and what we saw when the child tax credit was expanded and what we saw when different kinds of relief, eviction moratoriums were lifted, things like that. So you start to see a little bit more here about aging out of the system. What happens when youth are aging out? What's that story? Lived experience, support for families was showing up in 6% of the articles, behavioral health. So just a little bit more broadening of the topics that have traditionally been covered. But this next slide, I think, is the most exciting one. Oh, sorry, this one. The other one's fine too, but this one's a little bit better. So what we have seen is this noticeable uptick in stories that discuss prevention for families and children. The number of stories featuring the term prevention grew by 7%, from 14% in 2021 to 21% in 2022 until present day. So the media are paying attention, which means the public are paying attention. So this is the time to be talking about the importance of prevention. And because this is the time to be talking about the importance of prevention, I want to offer you a few resources on how to do that.
The key to happy childhoods is providing children with the loving support they need.
Maybe you
and
can,
the key to ensuring
do you mind backing it up if you're able? This is a video
primary caregivers
that I wanted to show
with
you.
the support they need. Because parents can parent better when they're not overloaded. The key to happy childhoods is providing children with the loving support they need. And the key to ensuring they get it is providing parents or other primary caregivers with the support they need. Because parents can parent better when they're not overloaded with the financial, emotional, and societal burdens that life can bring. Emotionally healthy caregivers foster healthy childhoods, which in turn create healthier communities. That's why it's up to all of us to play a part in reducing the obstacles to good parenting. It starts by realizing that childhood adversity, including child abuse and neglect, is a public issue. It's our responsibility to help give children the chance to flourish. And one way to do it is to enact policies and fund programs that address poverty, racism, mental health, substance use disorders, and other key stressors that can affect families. Childhood adversity is preventable. By focusing on the circumstances that lead to abuse and neglect, we can protect children's physical, intellectual, and emotional development, and allow them to reach their true potential. By putting policies in place now that strengthen families and promote well-being, we aren't just helping to prevent the issue of childhood adversity, we're helping to solve it. Building better childhoods starts by building a better foundation for parents and other caregivers. It's what every child deserves. Find out how you can play a part by visiting buildingbetterchildhoods.org.
So on this website, buildingbetterchildhoods.org, okay, you can find this video, you can find social media assets, you can find more videos, posters, talking points, sample op-eds. You name it, it's in there. If you want to be talking about prevention more often in your community and you want to get people to understand something like what you're doing in this learning collaborative, I encourage you to go to the website. You can download the whole toolkit and it'll come up as a zip drive with all of the different pieces together. But the reason that we started this campaign with Prevent Child Abuse America and with the Frameworks Institute through Social Current is because we were learning that the public really understood that child abuse and neglect is a serious problem. As a field, we'd done a very good job of convincing them that child abuse and neglect is awful and it's something that we need to stop. We haven't been telling them that we know how to stop it, that there is something that we can do about it, such as the strategies that all of your jurisdictions and tribes are deciding on. So how do we get that story out there? There's a reframing brief that the Frameworks Institute wrote that's called Reframing Childhood Adversity, Promoting Upstream Approaches, and you can find the brief on this same website as well. So what the brief does is it breaks down 6 different recommendations, how to talk about childhood adversity, including abuse and neglect, as a public issue, preventable problem, and solvable problem. So if there's nothing else that you remember, just remember those 3 categories. My colleague Jasmine has a little like mini Post-it note on her laptop that just says public, preventable, and solvable. And she tries to bring her thoughts, her ideas back to those 3 things. Because if you're thinking of those 3 things, you'll probably land in a pretty good space in terms of educating the public and each other about the importance. With a public issue, you want to make sure you are emphasizing shared responsibility, making the story one where we all have a stake and we all have a role to play in outcomes that matter. When children and families are doing well, we are all doing well. All children have the potential to thrive. It is our responsibility to help them get there, things like that. We also want to show how external conditions get under the skin, things like how poverty affects people, how a lack of housing affects people, how racism affects people. These things in society that they can't control has an impact on individuals, and we need to be able to explain that impact that systems have. Prevention. I'm going to emphasize number 4 here, talking about preventing an overload of stress. I know you talked to Claire Anderson earlier, so she might have mentioned it. She and I both really love this metaphor. The idea is that if there's a pickup truck with a really heavy load going down the street, it's a lot harder for that pickup truck to function than if it can offload some of those boxes. So thinking about your strategies, your policies in your communities as ways to offload those kinds of stresses from parents so they can be the parents they'd like to be. And then finally, solvable problem. Don't talk about adversity without talking about resilience. The one footnote here is when we talk about resilience, emphasizing that resilience is not an individual's responsibility by themselves. Resilience is a community-wide responsibility to make sure that people live in the conditions that can promote resilience. So trying to move things away from the individual lens to the more collective lens can be really helpful when we're talking about prevention. And then always including a promising or proven collective solution. You all have so many assets in your communities. You've got so many things out there to offer families. You've got home visiting programs, and you've got family resource centers, and you have housing programs, and you've got economic and concrete supports, and you've got mental health treatments. I know they're not all perfect, but you've got a lot of them. Let's make sure people know about what they are. And when you don't have enough of them or you don't have the right ones, knowing how to advocate for what you need. So I've talked about how culture matters. I've talked about how relationships are everything. And I've talked about how we're all communicators. So I hope that that gets you started on kind of your path of reflecting upon how the leadership skills you already have will really help you jumpstart your experience in the FAST LC. And again, thank you all so much for what you're doing. I'm going to be watching, and it's really exciting work. So thank you for having me.